Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show on News Talk 95.1 FM and 790 AM. KFYO, President Trump declaring a national emergency on the southern border. Now he's taking questions from members of the press. And we'll let you know if anything else comes out of the press conference at the White House. Joining us on the phones right now from our good friends over at the Texas Tribune, Patrick Svitek. Patrick, good morning. How are you?
Great. Good morning, Chad.
Thanks for joining us today. Appreciate it. Let's start off before we get into some of the legislature news. I know you're covering the Beto O'Rourke campaign, also the Julian Castro campaign. What's the latest for those two? What are they up to these days?
Yeah, so obviously increasingly intense speculation on O'Rourke nowadays. He has promised that he's going to make a decision on whether to enter the race by the end of the month. Getting very close to that, and he had another turn in the spotlight earlier this week when President Trump visited El Paso. They kind of had dueling rallies, and O'Rourke led a march there, both drawing pretty big crowds. I won't get into the specific.
You don't want to predict crowd sizes because, again, I went on record with you saying anywhere from 200 to 200,000 at both.
Yeah, right. So all I'll say is both of them drew pretty big and enthusiastic crowds. And, you know, for O'Rourke, it was certainly a moment to kind of seize on a tough contrast that he would have with the president if he were to ever face him in a presidential matchup. So it was an ideal kind of audition for him in some ways for going up against the president on a top national issue. Moving on from that, you know, he is now heading this weekend. O'Rourke is heading to both Wisconsin and Illinois, and it looks like this is kind of going to be a trip in the vein of the last trip he took where he drove outside of El Paso to New Mexico and Kansas and Oklahoma and some other parts of the Southwest. And so it looks like he's making kind of another regional trip this weekend, this time in the Midwest. And he does two events scheduled, one in at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and then one in Chicago. But it sounds like he may be making a few other stops. It sounds like it may be, perhaps another kind of trip where he makes impromptu visits to places. And so he's going to obviously continue to stay in the spotlight ahead of this 2020 decision, which, again, we hope is coming before the end of the month. And then you mentioned Julian Castro. Next week, he's making his first trip to Iowa as a presidential candidate. He has visited there many times before he announced, but this is his first trip as a presidential candidate. He's going to be there for about 3 days and do all the kind of stuff you do there as a presidential candidate, meet with state lawmakers, hold town halls, meet with college students, talk to the media, all the kinds of stuff that you do there. And so we'll be closely watching that trip to see how he's received there because there have been a lot of declared presidential candidates that have already made it to Iowa and have already laid the groundwork in Iowa. So it'll be interesting to see how he fits into that field, given that he's just now getting there as an official candidate.
If Beto O'Rourke's going to announce before the end of this month, in my opinion, it would be wise for him to announce on a Saturday or Sunday, and we've only got one of those left in this month, after this weekend, and he's not going to make an announcement this weekend. So if he announces on the 23rd or 24th, how soon does that information start coming out to you guys about, and then what do you think when you may start hearing the planning of an announcement? Is it going to be maybe like midweek next week? Do you think that's when we may start hearing some stuff come out?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question because, the way these things conventionally go is that a candidate, forms an exploratory committee and then, maybe a month later they send out a notice to the media saying, hey, I'm going to have a big announcement in my hometown this weekend. Come and see what I have to say. And everyone knows, what the announcement's going to be. And so it's all very kind of choreographed. With O'Rourke, I don't know if we're going to get that kind of organized of a rollout. I've talked to a lot of people who've said stuff like, I wouldn't be shocked if he just woke up tomorrow morning and just got on, Facebook Live and announced his campaign.
Yeah.
He's obviously kind of a spontaneous person, and he kind of, likes being, I don't want to say unpredictable, but likes being spur of the moment and likes being kind of close to his audience. And so I don't know how much of a heads up the media could get with a candidate like him.
Very interesting. Let's shift the focus over to the legislature. Anything interesting this week down in Austin?
Yeah, so we're continuing to see some intensifying debates over property taxes and school finance, the top two issues of the session by far, if only because the statewide leadership has told us that emphatically and repeatedly. And so we saw yesterday evening, we saw a development in that vein with State Senator Kel Seliger, Republican from Amarillo, coming out and making clear that he so far opposes the signature property tax bill in the Senate, SB 2. I think a lot of people suspected that this is where he was, but in an Austin American Statesman, he basically came out and said, I'm against this as it stands right now. This, again, is the bill that seeks to limit property tax growth, and critics of it, including Seliger, point out, as they've done in previous sessions, that it could really tie the hands of local officials and make their jobs very hard and potentially lead to a reduction in services. And so this now kind of complicates the political path or the political trajectory for the bill in the Senate. Without Seliger's support for this bill, it will be hard for a leadership to bring it to the floor without having to look for at least one Democratic senator to support it. Now, that's not outside the realm of possibility. There have been some Democrats in the past in the Senate that have shown some willingness to at least sign on to these bills to get them to the floor. But it certainly, complicates the path. And again, I think it just crystallizes Seliger's opposition. As you probably know, I think that it was pretty clear before this interview with the Statesman that he was not a huge fan of this proposal.
Yeah. Visiting with Patrick Svitek, Texas Tribune. What's the talk? Is there any talk down in Austin or around the Capitol that, since this is, since you have the big three who are united on this issue, are they going to, maybe sit down in a room with someone like Seliger, or are they you think maybe they've kind of given up hope on working anything with Seliger as far as property tax reform goes?
If they were smart, they would sit down with him and say, look, we have these here's where we're willing to negotiate and see if we can kind of negotiate within the contours of this debate. The thing is, the critical component of this bill is that rollback rate, which is currently set at 2.5% in the current proposal. I think there's room for negotiation on what that specific number can be. But recall, during the last session, I believe the Senate put that at 4%. And it's still, I think Seliger was still a vote against it. And so it's a little unclear, I think, where you could get Seliger by changing at least that component of the bill. He seems to be concerned about other aspects of property tax reform more than he seems to be concerned about that rollback rate. And so it's a little unclear to me now where the room for negotiation would be there. But there's no doubt that the pressure on him to get on board is going to be even more intense this time around than it was last time. I mean, last time, it was mainly Dan Patrick, I think, who was putting the pressure on him, given, as we just talked, given the unified focus on this issue across state government. I think you're going to have Greg Abbott and Dennis Bonnen and Dan Patrick, making up that pressure. And so it'll be interesting to see whether they think he's gettable ultimately, and if not, where they can find the Democratic support for this.
Yeah, absolutely. I know on Texas Tribune right now, y'all have got quite a few stories about the border wall, about the president declaring the national emergency, and some different perspectives on that. What else are you guys working on, and what are you working on for the future at the Texas Tribune's website?
Yeah, well, we're definitely watching to see what the Texas Republican reaction is to this national emergency declaration. You pointed out we had some stories up on our website yesterday about what Texas Republicans have said about the possibility of this declaration. Trump just made official, and so it'll be interesting to see what the reaction is now that it is a reality. Just anecdotally, just looking at a few different top statewide officials, there's been pretty mixed opinions. You've had Dan Patrick, Lieutenant Governor, saying he's all in on this idea. You've had the two U.S. Senators, Sean Cornyn and Ted Cruz, a little more cautious and having a little more reservations about it. And so I'm curious to see how that declaration tests Trump's political loyalties and alliances here in Texas, which obviously would be affected disproportionately by far by that declaration.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything big that people need to be on the lookout for next week in the legislature?
Committee hearings are going to continue. I think the property tax debate and what the path forward is without Seliger's support is going to be one that is going to continue to play out next week. And so that's what I'm potentially keeping an eye on. That in the Senate, that property tax bill has made it out of committee. But if you don't have the support to bring it to the floor, that's not going to happen yet. And so there may be a lot of behind the scenes maneuvering next week to figure out how they can get that bill to the floor.
Yeah, absolutely. Patrick Svitek with the Texas Tribune. Patrick, thank you very much. Tell folks how they can read more of what you got going on.
Yeah, we're at TexasTribune.org.
All right. Patrick, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's Patrick Svitek, Texas Tribune. You can also follow him on Twitter as well, at Patrick Svitek.